I'd like to welcome to the stage Auntie Faye, who's going to do our official welcome to country. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. I'll start off with acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, the Yorta Nation, and elders past and present. I welcome you all here tonight. And looking around, I am so proud of my culture, and looking around to see how many cultures we have just in this room. It is fantastic to see, and everybody should be proud of their own culture, like I am, and I love to share it with other people. So be welcome and have a great evening and and that lovely man, I'd love to have a yarn with him one day too. Look, it's just wonderful what you're doing. Absolutely wonderful. I know what it's like to be in a place where you had nothing, not welcome, and to find out that the beautiful things you're doing is absolutely wonderful. And I congratulate you. And I'll welcome you all here tonight. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name's Elizabeth Capp. I'm the head of La Trobe's Shepparton campus. First of all, thank you so much, Auntie Faye, for that lovely, warm welcome. It's a privilege for us to be here tonight. I also want to thank Liesl Parnell for her beautiful violin playing here tonight. And congratulations to Liesl, who's the winner of the 2019 Shepparton Young Instrumentalist Award, which is sponsored by the Sir Andrew and Lady Fairley Foundation. So thanks again. So on behalf of Andrew Fairley AM, Chair of the Sir Andrew and Lady Fairley Foundation, the Fairley Foundation trustees, Professor John Dewar, Vice-Chancellor of La Trobe University, my La Trobe colleagues, our Regional Advisory Board members, thank you all for joining us here tonight for the 2019 Fairley La Trobe Lecture, to be delivered by Julian Burnside, AOQC, Melbourne barrister, human rights and refugee advocate and author. The lecture is titled Building the Past, Building the Future, Immigration, Refugees, Multiculturalism. Julian's lecture will be recorded, so watch our Shepparton campus Facebook page for links to the recording. It's also being live streamed for those unlucky souls who were not able to get a ticket. La Trobe is really delighted to partner with the Fairley Foundation to present this annual lecture, as we've been doing since 2010. Our commitment to regional education in Victoria and to building higher education participation in our region is a really great fit with the Fairley Foundation vision and Sir Andrew's guiding philosophy. So it's now my very great pleasure to introduce Andrew Fairley. Andrew is the great-nephew of Sir Andrew and has been chair of the Sir Andrew and Lady Fairley Foundation for 20 years. Andrew and his co-trustees have continued the work and the philosophy of Sir Andrew to use philanthropy to make Greater Shepparton a vibrant, safer, more tolerant and higher achieving society through the creation of innovative partnerships. The Fairley Foundation's vision is to drive monumental social and cultural change in Greater Shepparton. One of the most significant initiatives that the Foundation has driven this year is the creation of the Greater Shepparton Foundation. And this new philanthropic beacon for Shepparton and the Goulburn Valley is a momentous step in addressing social disadvantage. Andrew is supported by a Deputy Chair, Carmel Johnson, and a committed group of family trustees. Andrew also practices as an equity lawyer in Melbourne and chairs Equip Super, a $16 billion industry super fund. He's the director of the Australian Financial Complaints Authority, a director of Qualitas Securities. He chairs the Foundation for Alcohol Research and Education and is deputy chair of the Mornington Peninsula Foundation. He also sits as an independent director on a number of family boards. And as he clearly has time on his hands, Andrew also carries on the family's long tradition in the fruit industry as a commercial cherry grower in the Yarra Valley. Andrew, La Trobe and the Greater Shepparton community thank you and the Foundation for your enormous contribution that is making a difference in our community. Please join me in welcoming Andrew to the stage to introduce our guest. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Elizabeth, and what a great pleasure it is to be here and to see so many people here for this annual lecture. This venue is a first for us. We normally would have it at the university, but we've got such a rock star speaker here tonight that we have 300 people who've asked to come and 80 more who are on the waiting list. So it's wonderful that you have all made it. I want to acknowledge Auntie Faye, thank you for your welcome to country. I want to also acknowledge the traditional custodians of this country on which we are meeting tonight, and to pay our respects to elders past, present, and for those who are coming through. There are a number of acknowledgements, some of whom Elizabeth has already acknowledged, but my principal acknowledgement, of course, is to Julian. It's wonderful, Julian, to have you here, and Jenny, your sister, and Pat O'Connell, my old mate from Shepparton. It's really great to see you as well. All of the Trobe people that Elizabeth has welcomed. I also welcome you, Wendy Lovell, the member for Northern Victoria, Gary Smith, who's the chair of the Greater Shepparton Foundation, Paul Briggs, the chair of the Kaila Institute. Paul, it's great to have you here. Fiona Smolnars, who's the chair of the Shepparton Festival, Genevieve Simpson, who's our new principal of the Greater Shepparton Foundation, sorry, not the foundation, the Greater Shepparton College, which is being built, and Rebecca Coates, who is the CEO of SAM. I mean, how good Shepparton, look at that SAM coming up from Victoria, that's fabulous. And Matthew Sharp, the CEO of the Goulburn Valley Health and of the trustees. It's such a great pleasure for me to be able to welcome all of you and to introduce Julian to you this evening. This is the 9th Fairley Latrobe lecture that has taken place, and the genesis of this lecture really was to celebrate the incredible contribution and commitment that Sir Andrew had to regional Victoria and also regional Australia. He was unashamedly a great supporter of regional, rural and remote Australia, and as you know, he turned SPC into the food icon that it is today and hopefully will remain. He was also the longest serving, many people don't know, he was the longest serving Commissioner of the State Electricity Commission, and I think his iconic act as the stewardship of the State Electricity Commission was that when he started there were 2,400 farms in Victoria that were connected to electricity. By the time he left, there were 36,000, and he regarded that as one of his great achievements on that organisation. He was also obviously involved very much in local government. This lecture seeks to celebrate the contribution that regional Australia has made to the rich fabric of Australian society, and both past and present, and to reflect on the aspiration that the regional and remote areas can make in the future. And that's really been the basis upon which we've selected our speakers in past years. And Elizabeth spoke of the innovative partnerships that we forge. One of the innovative partnerships that we have is with La Trobe University, and we're just delighted that partnership is so profoundly impactful, both for us in the work that we do and I hope for La Trobe. La Trobe is best known for its campus at Bundoora as a deliverer of fabulous quality higher education. What's less known is that it's Victoria's only statewide university and the largest provider of higher education in regional Victoria, and I think that's a great tribute to the Vice-Chancellor, John Dewar, who's here with us tonight and who you will hear from later. Before I introduce Julian for this year's lecture, I want to make a couple of remarks about the Fairley Foundation. Institutions like us are only strong because of the support that we receive from our key stakeholders. We work with many organisations in Shepparton and beyond through the Goulburn Valley, and they consistently deliver on the projects that we fund. They make a promise, they deliver on it, and they do great work in changing the lives and creating opportunities for those with social or physical disadvantage. And to them I pay tribute, and I thank you from the bottom of our hearts for the honesty and integrity that you bring to the relationship that we have. None of this can happen without a really committed group of trustees, and to you, all of you are here this evening, I do want to thank you for your enthusiasm, for your innovation, and for your incredible commitment to the work that we do in Shepparton. As Elizabeth said in her introduction, the creation of the Greater Shepparton Foundation has fundamentally changed the philanthropic landscape in this community, and we now have a public benevolent institution, a DGR1, for the first time, so that we're able to attract funds that can address some of the really wicked social issues that still are pervasive in some parts of this community. And I'm not going to go into the complexities and labyrinths of the laws of charities, other than to say that it is quite difficult to establish a DGR1 so that we can access family money from private ancillary funds and for other generous philanthropists. And now that we have done that, I think it will make such a fundamental difference to the philanthropic landscape in this community, and we are delighted to have been part of that. It's been formed with a local board, some of whose directors are here this evening, a full-time CEO in Cheryl Hammer, and has really big plans. And it's now merged with the Goulburn Valley Community Fund, as many of you will know, and the Fairley Foundation has committed $100,000 a year for the next 5 years to support those great big plans that the Greater Shepparton Foundation has, and I hope we'll use that money to build further resources into it. Well, the inaugural Fairley Foundation, the Fairley Trobe lecture was given 9 years ago by Rupert Meyer, and when he was projecting what might happen and what might be the essence of this lecture, he said in that paper, he said, "I hope that speakers in the future might choose to make a major contribution, not just agenda setting and policy developments for regional Australia, but to explore the implications of those agendas and to really drill into how that can be delivered." And I think over the years we've had some fabulous speakers who've done exactly that. And tonight we are unbelievably fortunate to have Julian to speak with us. His presentation, as Elizabeth said, is building the past, building the future, immigration, refugees, multiculturalism. And that trinity is of great relevance to Shepparton and to the Goulburn Valley. My great-grandfather came here in 1886, and that is a manifestation of the importance of immigration to this place. It settled tens of thousands of people arriving from many different parts of the world over 150 years. In addition to that diverse ethnicity, this has one of the largest Aboriginal communities in Victoria and indeed in Australia in one place, and that gives Shepparton a rightful claim as a reputation to be one of Australia's most multicultural cities. Julian is very well known as a member of the Victorian Bar, a Queen's Counsel, and a prominent member of the community with many different and diverse interests. As a lawyer, he's highly regarded in commercial litigation, in administrative law and trade practices law, but he has also dealt in some pretty contentious areas of the law and its treatment of those who are bereft of legal help and support and who live on the margins of society. As a supporter of the arts with his wife Kate, who regrettably was coming but is unable to be here, he's well known as a philanthropist in supporting community arts, music, drama, and using cross-cultural relationships and understanding through the arts to build understanding. He's chair of the Melbourne Arts Venue 45 downstairs, a fabulous place. If you haven't been there, you must go. It has such diverse offerings in the arts, it's extraordinary. Publicly, he's probably best known, not just because he was a candidate in the last election, but also as an advocate of the rights of asylum seekers and other oppressed people, and in his pursuit of justice and of fairness. And he's been particularly vocal in relation to the offshore processing and the rights of the individuals who are massively impacted by that policy. He's also authored a number of books, some of which I've been fortunate enough to read, though I've missed the one on philology, I must say, Julian, but I've read that moving set of essays on justice or injustice. Will you please join me in welcoming Julian Burnside to give the 2019 Fairley Latrobe Lecture.
Well, thanks very much, Andrew. Some years ago, I heard Michael Kirby give the Alan Misson oration at Federation Square, and he said on that occasion that an oration which is named after a person should say something about the person in whose name the oration was given. He reminded me of that a few years later when I gave the Michael Kirby oration. The Fairley Latrobe lecture is given in honour of Sir Andrew and Lady Fairley, and it gets the Latrobe bit, I think, because of the university. I hope I'm right, I gather I'm right, because I'm not going to be saying much about Charles Latrobe, about whom a full lecture would be very interesting, although not necessarily flattering. Andrew Walker Fairley, the brother of Fred, who was the grandfather of this Andrew, was born in Scotland in February 1884 at a place called Grangemouth, which is about 20 kilometres west of Edinburgh. I'm very pleased that he came from Scotland because I have a fair bit of Scottish heritage in my background, and my sister lives in Shepparton, so the two come together very neatly. Andrew Fairley was only 2 years old when his family migrated to Australia, and they came to Shepparton in 1887, I think. He was educated in Shepparton and later in Launceston. His mother's nickname for him, unknown origin, was Ab, spelled A-double-B. No one knows why, but he was known as Ab with one B for the rest of his life. In 1927, he became the first mayor of the borough of Shepparton, and in 1948-49, he became the first mayor of the city of Greater Shepparton. So the connection is very powerful. In 1947, he was made a commander of the Order of St Michael and St George, and in 1951, he was made a Knight of the British Empire. And that was in recognition of his services to the fruit industry and regional Australia. Very, very important. Sir Andrew was instrumental in putting together the money to establish the Shepparton Art Gallery, or Shepparton Art Museum, or SAM as Andrew refers to it. I always think of it as the Shepparton Art Gallery, and I'm sorry for that. He gathered together the initial capital. It was founded in 1937. It came into its present premises, I think, in 65, and the new premises are being put together right at the moment on the banks of the lake, largely, as I understand, because of the idea of Carrillo Gantner, who wanted to donate his collection of Aboriginal paintings to a gallery. He asked the National Gallery of Victoria whether it would be shown, and they said probably not. He asked the gallery here whether it would be shown, and they said probably not, because we don't have the space. And so, as I understand it, he said, well, look, if you can promise to show it, and if you put together a gallery sufficiently big to show it, I'll give it to you. And that's how it's coming about. Fantastic recognition of the importance of the arts. And it's also notable that in his will, Sir Andrew left a large amount of capital to the existing SAM, and SPC donated £25,000, and that was in 1965, a hell of a lot of money in those days. He left a generous estate when he died in 1965, and this foundation, with its annual lectures, is one consequence of that. And the Sir Andrew and Lady Fairley Foundation benefits registered charities across Victoria. Now, Shepparton ought to be proud of its gallery. The arts, in my opinion, are probably the most important area of human activity. It's no accident that I'm married to an artist. And it's not because of her that I think that. I've always thought that. I've always had that view. I've always hung around with artists a lot. And there's an interesting way of testing the importance of the arts, and it's this. Just imagine a room full of people with 50 or 60 people in it, all people of fair education and fair intelligence. Give them a list of names from the last 5 or 6 centuries. I guarantee that out of all proportion, they will recognise the names of sculptors, painters, poets, composers, but not lawyers, economists, accountants, management consultants. You know? Okay, I think the laughter suggests that you agree with me. I mean, most people have heard of Dickens and Dostoevsky and Da Vinci and Tchaikovsky and Beethoven, but can they name any economist or lawyer or management consultant from the same times? Probably not. I think it is very important that we recognise how significant the arts are, and I want to mention in particular Liesl Parnell, who was playing the violin here before, and unfortunately most people were in conversation and didn't hear what she was playing, but it's a quiet tribute to the importance of the arts that someone like Liesl was playing this evening. And everyone in this room, I hope, understands just how important the arts are. It may be one of the few traces of the merits of humankind that we leave. Now, 17th of July, I was interested when Andrew invited me to speak on the 17th of July because it's quite a good date and it's appropriate for some of the topics that I intend to cover. 17th of July, 1717 was the first performance of Handel's water music. It was done on a barge that sailed down the Thames with King George I on board, and he was very pleased. It was done as an act of contrition, I think it's fair to say, because Handel had been Kapellmeister to George of Hanover. He asked for a leave of absence to go to London to see how things were there. He liked London very much, and he decided to stay. He received an annual £100, I think, from Queen Anne, and he stayed on. To his astonishment, George of Hanover became George I of England, and so he met his former boss sort of accidentally when George came over to England to take the throne. And so he wrote the water music as a sort of act of contrition, and he later famously wrote the 4 coronation anthems. One of them, the second, Zadok the Priest, has been played at every coronation of a British monarch since the 18th century. It's remarkable. And it was played at the coronation of George V, who on the 17th of July 1917 changed the family's surname. Of course, this is in the late stages of the First World War. He changed the family's surname from Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to Windsor. The fact that they needed to do it is not all that surprising. On the 17th of July 1762, Catherine II, who was also known as Catherine the Great, became Tsar of all Russia after the murder of Peter III of Russia. The Russians do stuff like that, which makes it appropriate that on the 17th of July 2014, Malaysian Airlines flight MH17 crashed near the border of Ukraine and Russia, apparently brought down by Russian fire. So they do this sort of thing. And I mention this next date with specific reference to Scott Morrison, who will not fare nicely in this talk. On the 17th of July 1998, a diplomatic conference agreed to adopt the Rome Statute. The Rome Statute created the International Criminal Court. A condition of entry to membership of the International Criminal Court is that you introduce into your domestic legislation laws which mirror the laws in the Statute of Rome. The Statute of Rome established laws against genocide, various war crimes and various crimes against humanity. So in October 2002, Australia modified its laws, its Commonwealth Criminal Code, so as to introduce a law prohibiting genocide. Up until then, it was not unlawful to commit genocide in Australia, apparently. It introduced various war crimes, and it introduced various crimes against humanity, which is important because the way Scott Morrison, as Immigration Minister, treated refugees in Australia constituted a criminal offence contrary to our Commonwealth Criminal Code in reflection of the Statute of Rome. And that was important because, unfortunately, the legislation in the Commonwealth Criminal Code says that a person cannot be prosecuted for an offence against that section, Section 268, except with the written permission of the Attorney-General. So don't hold your breath. Now, I want to refer briefly to, Auntie Faye's gone. I wanted to thank Auntie Faye for her welcome to country and her acknowledgement of the traditional owners. I would supplement that acknowledgement when you consider that we've only been here for 231 years and the Aboriginal population had been here for 50 or 60,000 years. To put that in context, human beings invented agriculture just 10,000 years ago. So for a population to be stable in one place for 50 or 60,000 years is pretty remarkable. But I would extend the acknowledgement of the traditional owners of the land by also acknowledging that our ancestors took it from them and don't plan to give it back. And we caused them immense harm. And it was not until the Mabo decision in 1992 that the foundation for the rejection of Aboriginal land claims was first overturned. The basis for ignoring Aboriginal land claims up till then was that the Aboriginal people did not have a notion of ownership of land. The relationship between Aboriginal people and their land is more like the relationship between child and parent. Now, most people in this room, however close you are to your parents, probably don't think you own them. But in the Mabo case, the High Court said that their claim to the land was sufficiently close to the notion of ownership that it ought to be acknowledged that we had taken it off them, and if it hadn't been taken off them by us, then it remained available to them. So, our ancestors took the land from them, caused them immense harm, like separating child and parent, and then we redoubled the harm by taking their children from them. And right now, except maybe in Shepparton, we seem to have no coherent ideas about how to repair the harm that we did. And it is worth remembering that, and it's specifically important in this city that the treatment of Aboriginal people is so enlightened. And I say that only partly because my sister worked with Aboriginal people for her first, how many years? Number of years in Shepparton. Now, there's another thing that we need to understand about Australia. In his final speech as President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, of whom I'm not generally a fan, said something really quite important. He said, you can go to Paris and live there and not become a Parisian. You can go to Germany or Turkey or Japan and not become German or Turkish or Japanese. But people from all around the globe come to America and they become Americans. And the same is true of Australia. People from all around the globe come here and become Australians. And it's one of the great strengths we have. And I was very interested before we started the official proceedings to talk to Vincent, who comes from Nigeria originally and has lived in... you've reminded me of a story. Vincent does sonogram things. He's a sonography technologist, and he came to Australia 25 years ago, but he's lived in Shepparton for 14 years. There may be a number of women here who've had his ultrasounds done for their children. Anyway, it's a perfect example of what Shepparton is like, and it's one of Shepparton's great strengths, in my opinion. The story that you remind me of was Con Heliotis, who's a very senior criminal barrister in Melbourne. He was giving his final address to the jury in the county court in a very nasty rape trial, and his mobile phone went off. But it wasn't in his jacket, and it wasn't in his bag. It was in the pocket of his coat over the back of a chair at the back of the court. And so without a word, he walked away from the bar table, went up to the back of the court, pulled it up, pulled out his phone, turned it off, put it back, dropped it back over the chair and said, "Don't you ever do that again." Sir Andrew Fairley, as I mentioned before, had a brother, Fred. Fred established the Shepparton Preserving Company after having, I think at around about the same time, formed a land subdivision business with Andrew. The Shepparton Preserving Company, of course, became very important in Shepparton's history. It ran into financial difficulty, and Sir Andrew came along and rescued it. When he came in and started rescuing it, he did not accept a wage or any form of benefit until after it had recovered its financial fortune. He became chairman of SPC in 1924, and in 2002 it merged with Ardmona. I went to the premises today in Andrew Fairley Avenue. It is an amazing place. I mean, I'm sure you've all seen it, but I had not been there before. I'd seen photographs, but it's huge. It's tempting to think that Andrew Fairley, as a child, would never have realised just how important his name would become in this city and how important his contribution to this city would be. His success in rescuing SPC was the subject of an article in the Shepparton News in 1925, which included this paragraph. "We feel that we would be acting unworthily if we didn't recognise the special service conferred upon the company by the present Chairman of Directors, Mr. A.W. Fairley. He has been the helmsman who kept the ship on her proper course, has high courage, enabling him to face the worst tempest without blanching." And that purple prose also included a reference to his consummate business ability, and it actively supported the idea that he should become the managing director of SPC. That happened the following year, as it happens, in 1926, when he was about 40. Under his leadership, SPC became one of the largest cooperative fruit canning plants in Australia, and apart from the other bequests in his will, he left a legacy to each member of SPC who'd been with the company for more than 5 years. Now, Shepparton's fortunes have been built by people who came here from other places and became Australians. The population includes, of course, people from Great Britain, which still includes Scotland and Northern Ireland, although after Brexit, who can tell? It also includes people from Sudan and the Congo, from Albania, the Punjab, Iraq and Afghanistan. And I would go this far as to say that Shepparton is a model of multiculturalism in Australia. I was interested talking to Vincent before, who pointed out that social arrangements in this city tend to be pretty good and pretty peaceful, which is a tremendous achievement, and it is exactly what multiculturalism ought to be. I think Shepparton is a model of the way multiculturalism should be implemented in every city in Australia. It's an example of the way Australia can build its future. But let's be blunt about it. We've not always appreciated the merits of people who come to Australia from other parts of the world. When I was growing up in Melbourne with my sister, who once chopped my hand off, or tried to, no right of reply. there were quite a few people who'd come to Australia from Italy and Greece, especially people who'd fled Europe after the end of the war, people who'd come to Australia for the Snowy Scheme and so on. And I do remember people of our parents' generation, although not our parents, I'm glad to say, muttering darkly about the Italian families who lived around the corner from us, saying things like, you know, the mothers all dress from head to foot in black, and they don't learn English, and they're too religious and they have too many children. The sort of stuff you hear said these days about Muslim migrants to Australia. It's remarkable. I do remember very clearly that back then, and I'm talking 50s and 60s, Sunday lunch was lamb and 3 veg. And the idea that you could have coffee with froth on the top, or spaghetti that didn't come out of a tin, or that, horror of all horrors, you would eat squid, these were unthinkable things. But the fact is, eventually, bit by bit, we discovered that these things were okay, and our culture is all the better for it. It just takes Australians a little time to recognise the benefits of multiculturalism, which is a great pity, because we could do better than calling them the equivalent of ITIs and WOGs, or REFOs or DPs, as they used to be called before. It's also worth remembering how Australian culture has been enriched by people who come from Vietnam, from India, from Sri Lanka, and so on. So, there is a fundamental challenge when there is a great disparity between the culture of new arrivals on the one hand and the existing culture. How do you reconcile the cultural differences that inevitably emerge, such as froth on the coffee? Examples are pretty easy to think of. Would we scorn the idea of a halal or kosher butcher? No. Do we recoil at the idea of sitting on the floor to have our dinner? Most people wouldn't. But I do remember how we reacted badly to similar cultural differences in the 50s and 60s. What, however, about women who wear a hijab or a burqa, and I wouldn't ask Pauline Hanson that question, or the niqab, which is a bit more challenging. That's the one where you can only see the wearer's eyes. It seems to me we shouldn't make a fuss about it, we should simply roll with it. These are cultural attributes that do not do any harm to any of us. Shepparton seems to have worked its way through difficulties like that, and more importantly, it is able to look at the questions without feeling it's under attack. And I think it would be a great benefit if the rest of Australia had the same capacity that Shepparton has shown. Now, as many of you are aware, I've been concerned in recent times about the way we treat refugees. There's a number of reasons for that. Many of them reflect simply my personal values and my moral concerns, but one of them is pragmatic. Refugees have helped to build Australia and will do so in the future if only we give them the chance. We have 3 streams of refugees coming to Australia. Most people aren't aware of this. The first stream is the so-called Offshore Resettlement stream. These are people who are approached by Australia and invited to come to Australia with refugee protection, typically from camps in places like Africa. It's naturally, there's a quota on it, and it's around about just short of 14,000 a year. It's a very, very good program. Not every country has a similar program. It's not entirely selfless. I had a conversation with, I think it was John Menadue, who had been Secretary of the Department of Immigration under Malcolm Fraser. And he was sent to a camp to get people for the Offshore Resettlement scheme, and said to the leader of the camp, "Have you got any doctors or engineers?" And the person in charge of the camp looked at him sorrowfully and said, "I'm afraid we've only got widows and orphans." Now, some asylum seekers, that's to say people who claim to be refugees, arrive in Australia by aeroplane. They're people who've managed to get a visa, a student visa, business visa, holiday visa, whatever, and they come to Australia, and as soon as they clear passport control, they apply for protection, and they are allowed to live in the community. They cause no harm to anyone. Most of them turn out not to be refugees. On our assessment, between 30 or 40% of them are ultimately accepted as refugees, but they live in the community and no one is worried by their presence. Most people don't even know they exist. The third stream is boat people, and it's in relation to boat people that Australia performs really, really badly. Boat people typically come from countries which produce so many refugees that they can't get any visa to come to Australia, because Australia figures that they'll probably apply for asylum once they get inside the country. And so they can't get on a plane, because those of you who've travelled overseas, you know when you get on a plane in a foreign country to fly to Australia, the airline staff check your credentials very carefully to make sure you're allowed to come into Australia. Why? Because the government has told them if they bring anyone to Australia who's not allowed to land here, they've got to take them back at their own expense. So that's why they are very careful to ensure that everyone who flies to Australia is actually allowed in. So people who can't get a visa can't get on a plane. And so they work their way down typically to Malaysia or Thailand or Indonesia. And there they use a people smuggler, and the people smuggler will put them on a boat, and it's a much more dangerous and much more expensive way of getting to Australia to seek asylum. Incidentally, at the time of the Tampa case, which sort of focused Australia's mind on the existence of boat people, at the time of the Tampa case, most of the boat people coming to Australia seeking refugee protection were coming from the central parts of Asia, and in order to get down to Indonesia, they did not pass through any country that had signed the Refugees Convention. We were the first country they could get to which actually had signed the Refugees Convention and which could offer them protection if they were refugees. So the idea that they were forum shopping or economic refugees was simply untrue. The past few decades, at least until the time of Tampa, showed very few boat people coming to Australia. The highest number ever of boat people ever to come into Australia was just short of 25,000 in 1 year. Now, in a country that's not exactly tiny and not really cramped, 25,000 isn't a big number. Our population is, 25 million, give or take? So 1 in 1,000 is the addition to our population by boat people who've come here in the past. Now, a refugee is defined in the Refugees Convention, which we signed back in 1954. It means a person who is outside their country of origin and is unable or unwilling to return to it because of a well-founded fear of persecution on the grounds of race, religion, etc. The central obligation in the Refugees Convention is the so-called non-refoulement obligation, which means you're not allowed to send a person back to a place where they might be persecuted, either directly or indirectly. So you can't send them back to a non-convention country, and you can't send them back to their country of origin. The reason you can't send them back to a non-convention country is that there's nothing to stop that country from sending them back to the country they belong to. That would be an indirect refoulement. So not every country has signed the Refugees Convention. As I say, we signed it pretty early on. It was formulated initially in 1951 in response to the Second World War. And one of the most notorious episodes which provoked it, I think, before the Second World War was the St. Louis. Now, I don't know how many people in this room know of the voyage of the St. Louis, but it was a ship that left Hamburg in May of 1939 with 900 Jews on board, all of them seeking protection from what was going on in Germany back then. Gustav Schroeder was the name of the captain, and he tried every trick in the book to get them somewhere safe. He ended up at Cuba. Cuba wouldn't take them. He ended up being warned off the coast of America at gunpoint and ended up taking them back to the Low Countries in Europe. I can't remember which, it wasn't Belgium, but it was one of the Low Countries anyway. And they were put ashore there, and because those countries weren't yet involved in the Second World War, and by the end of the war, more than half of them had died in concentration camps. Now, Gustav Schroeder was a people smuggler. On any view of things, he was a people smuggler, but he was also a hero. And it's worth remembering that next time you hear a politician bagging people smugglers, because the fact is people smugglers do a job which is demand-driven and which saves lives. Now, when people use people smugglers to get to Australia, they typically arrive at Christmas Island, which is a tiny speck of Australian sovereign territory in the Indian Ocean. It's closer to Jakarta than it is to Darwin. When they arrive there, and this is until offshore processing became mandatory in 2013, but when they arrive there, they would typically have come from countries which were landlocked, so they've never seen the ocean, let alone been on it. They've typically had not enough to eat or drink. They've typically had no opportunity to change their clothes or to wash. They typically arrive terrified and wearing clothing caked with their own excrement. And the Immigration Department of Australia doesn't even let them change before they're interviewed to see whether they have a valid refugee claim. When they arrive, if they have any medical devices, such as false teeth or hearing aids or spectacles or artificial limbs, those are taken and not returned. If they have any medicine, it is taken from them and not returned. And I was told that one of the IHMS doctors there had the full-time job of sitting in front of a bin popping pills out of blister packs for later destruction. If they have any medical documentation, it is taken from them and not returned. They are interviewed by immigration to see whether they have a plausible claim for protection, and they're interviewed by an IHMS, that's International Health and Medical Services, doctor, to see whether there's any reason why they should not be sent off to Manus Island or Nauru. This is the time after the formation of the Pacific Solution in 2001. A doctor who'd worked on Christmas Island told me a story. She was aware of a refugee applicant on Christmas Island who had not been sent off to Nauru because it was thought that she was insane. The problem was they didn't know what the nature of her insanity was, because she didn't have any medical documentation, she didn't have any pills, they'd all been destroyed. So the doctor decided that she would have a long discussion with this woman to see what the problem was. It was difficult because they didn't have a language in common, and although they're sitting on opposite sides of a small table, the interpreter was in Sydney, 5,500 kilometres away. So it was a difficult consultation. But she eventually worked out that this woman's problem was that she was incontinent of urine, and she couldn't leave her cabin without having urine running down her leg, and that was driving her mad. So the doctor said to immigration, "We need incontinence pads." Their initial response was, "We don't do those." She insisted. They relented, but said she can only have 4 a day. More than that would be a fire hazard. That's the sort of thing that we've been doing to people. Now, in 2013, as you will probably remember, Tony Abbott became Prime Minister of Australia, and his Immigration Minister was Scott Morrison. Scott Morrison, what do you say about Scott Morrison? I've been saying unpleasant things about his morality and honesty for years, and he's never contacted me to say stop saying it, which is interesting. Scott Morrison was, as Immigration Minister, he issued a directive to the department that those people known formally as irregular maritime arrivals, boat people we would say, must thereafter be referred to as illegal maritime arrivals. He called boat people illegal probably more often than any other Minister of the Crown in this country. The problem with it is it's a lie, because they don't commit any offence whatever by coming here uninvited, without a visa, asking for protection from persecution. It's In fact, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to which we contributed a great deal before it was formed in 1948, in Article 14 says that all human beings have the right to seek asylum. Not surprising when you consider what had happened in the preceding decade or so. So Morrison continued to call them illegal and made it formal in the department that they must be referred to as illegal. He also went to Nauru and Manus several times and said to the people there that they would never be allowed to settle in Australia. And I'm sure a number of you are familiar with that notion that the people who we force off Australia will never be allowed to resettle here. The interesting thing about that is, of course, since formal offshore processing became the law, and it was introduced, let's remember, by Kevin Rudd in 2013 before the election, it's been on foot ever since then. So most of the people who remain on Nauru and Manus have been in detention for more than 6 years. More than 6 years. One of Scott Morrison's other little bits of nastiness was that he renamed the Department of Immigration and Citizenship the Department of Immigration and Border Protection. Now think about that. He calls them illegals and he calls the process of pushing them away border protection. Now, that gives the clear impression to anyone who only reads the Murdoch press that we are being protected from criminals, which, if it was true, would make sense, but it's a lie. And I think one of the worst things you can say about Scott Morrison is that he lies about boat people being illegal, and then he treats them like criminals so as to reinforce the message. And I have to say, although I parted company with the church quite a long time ago, my recollection of Christian teaching suggests that his response to boat people is very far from the Christian message. That's why I've been saying for quite a while he's a dishonest hypocrite. Mental health problems on Manus and Nauru are endemic. A recent report by the Refugee Council of Australia included this: there are increasing incidents of self-harm and spiralling mental health problems. People, including young children, repeatedly try to kill or harm themselves. They've tried to do so by pouring petrol on themselves, drinking washing up liquid, hanging themselves, and setting their houses on fire. At least 2 people have suicided, one by lighting himself on fire in front of UN officials. And in December of 2017, an application was brought to the Federal Court of Australia to bring a child from Nauru for proper mental health treatment. The evidence showed that the child was suicidal, but couldn't be treated adequately on Nauru. And remember, Nauru is 2 square kilometres smaller than Tullamarine Airport. It is not a place which can take a huge population. One of the reports, I think it is a report that was used in the case, major mood disorder and suicidal ideation and intent in a 10-year-old child are rare and extremely serious conditions with a high risk of prolonged disorder and suicidal behaviour if inadequately treated. There's considerable risk in the event of inadequate treatment where a child has ongoing ideas of suicide, and particularly where they express intent and have plans. In my view, the child remains at extreme risk of suicide if there is no immediate attention to her mental illness and transfer to a psychiatric facility. And I remember, because I was in the case, counsel for Peter Dutton, who at that point was the Immigration Minister, opposed an order being made that the child be brought to Australia for treatment. Counsel argued that the child shouldn't be brought to Australia for treatment until after the action had been tried. This was the very first appearance in the thing. The judge, who's not one of my favourites, I have to say, looked at counsel for Peter Dutton and said, the trouble with your suggestion is she may be dead by then. And he ordered that she be brought. He said, in my view, the applicant's psychiatric condition is very serious. She poses an extreme suicide risk, and she should be immediately admitted into a specialist child mental health facility for assessment, containment and treatment. There is no such facility on Nauru. I'm disinclined to accept that outpatient treatment, coupled with a child psychiatrist visiting every few months or even every month, will provide the mental health care treatment the applicant needs and adequately protect her in relation to the risk of suicide. I do not consider that the OMR process is adequate or likely to be sufficiently swift to adequately protect against the risk of suicide. It reminded me of a case that I was involved in some years before, and I would attribute to this case the fact that I've hung in on this issue for a fairly long time. It was shortly after the Tampa case. The Tampa case, by the way, the judgment in the Tampa case was handed down at 2:15 in the afternoon on the 11th of September 2001, 8 or 9 hours before the attack on America. And as soon as the attack on America happened, John Howard started calling boat people illegal. And since you understand how it worked. The other case that happened some months after that concerned a family from Iran, mum and dad and 2 daughters, who at the relevant times were aged 7 and 11. And they got to Australia. They were put in Woomera Detention Centre, which was in the South Australian desert, has since closed. And after about 15 or 18 months, they were all doing it pretty hard, but especially the 11-year-old, who had completely given up. She had stopped eating, she had stopped grooming herself, she had stopped brushing her teeth, she had stopped brushing her hair, she was frightened to go to the toilet block, which was a couple of 100 metres from their cabin, and so she would wet the bed every night, she'd wet her clothes every day. And a psychiatrist who heard about it went to Woomera and had a chat to the kid and to her parents and delivered a devastating psych report, which included a copy of a drawing she had done at his request. It was a drawing of a bird in a cage. The cage had a padlock on it, and she'd said to him she was the bird. Anyway, his report, which I think is still the most devastating psych report I've read in my involvement in these things, said that the child was at extreme risk, that she needed daily psychiatric care, and that back then in Woomera, if you needed psychiatric care, you'd get to see the visiting psychiatrist roughly once every 6 or 7 months. She needed daily psychiatric care. So the department moved the family, mum and dad and 2 daughters, to Melbourne, the Maribyrnong Detention Centre in Melbourne. And although the reason for moving them was that the 11-year-old kid needed daily psychiatric care, for the first few weeks of their stay in Maribyrnong, nobody came to see her. Not a psychiatrist, not a nurse, not a doctor, not a social worker, nobody. It was as if they hadn't arrived. On a Sunday night in May of 2002, while her mother and father and her young sister were in the mess hall having dinner, this little girl took a bedsheet and hanged herself. But she was still strangling when the family came back to their room, and they took her down. She and her mother were taken to the local general hospital in company with 2 ACM guards. So as a matter of legal analysis, they were still in immigration detention. Con Karapanagiotidis from the Asylum Seekers Resource Centre, which hadn't been operating for even a year at that point, he was looking after their refugee visa claim, heard about it, went to the hospital about 9:30 on the Sunday night, said good day to the guards who know him pretty well because he's a regular visitor of Maribyrnong, and he said, I just want to speak to the mother to see if there's anything I can do to help. The guards said to him, you can't see them because lawyers' visiting hours in immigration detention are 9 to 5, and they sent him away. He then rang me at home, and I have to say I am still furious that we could so badly mistreat anyone, that a 10-year-old child would try and kill herself and then turn away people who are simply offering help. It's a scandal, and it's a scandal that this country will ultimately regret, I hope. The ARC recently said about children who had been held on Nauru until very recently these kids are not all right. In fact, we know that many are showing symptoms of traumatic withdrawal syndrome, a condition brought about by the isolation of being trapped on Nauru. They stop eating and drinking, and they can barely talk or move. And then they just decline to a point where they're in bed and their parents can't get any form of sustenance into them. They continue to deteriorate until their life is threatened by heart or kidney failure. It's really a critical situation for their physical health, but it's created by their mental health. And that's what Australia is doing to people who are escaping horrors which we can scarcely imagine. It is almost beyond belief. It's only boat people who are caught up in that sort of treatment. Over the last 20 years, more than 90% of boat people have ultimately succeeded in establishing to our satisfaction that they are refugees. So we completely ignored, we're untroubled by the ones who are probably not refugees, but we lock up and punish the ones who are almost certainly refugees. Why do we do that? Scott Morrison's contribution as Immigration Minister I've already mentioned. I guess his performance as Immigration Minister and your assessment of him as Prime Minister will probably depend on your view of what the facts are. If you think that this cruelty is protecting us from criminals, then it makes sense and it's probably good that he succeeded. But it's false. It is not true. We don't need to be protected. I mean, have a look at, why do children get such attention in the public debate about refugees? Because we've been told it's border protection, they're illegals. In brackets, you're being protected from criminals. You see a photograph of a 5-year-old kid kicking around in the dirt in Nauru. It's very hard to think that you need to be protected from her. It's very hard to think of her as a criminal. And yet, that's the lie that we've been fed, and I can tell you, as someone who's been trying every trick in the book for 18 years, it is very, very difficult to get the truth out there. It's very difficult. Read The Guardian Australia and you will see the facts about our refugee treatment given, and unfortunately the public in Australia have been conned into believing lies. Morrison's willingness to mislead the public, I think, was enhanced by him changing the name of the department. And it was one part of what seems like a calculated political strategy to deliver him ministerial success so that he could climb the ladder. Now, I don't know what sort of person you have to be to build your political fortunes on deliberately inflicting misery and pain and suffering and possibly death on innocent men, women and children. But he's done it. Now, the deceptive language that we've been using for years now, I think has produced great difficulties in this country. And what has it cost the country, apart from our reputation? It's the offshore processing system costs Australia about $5,000 million a year. It's a lot of money, and it's your taxes at work. It's no novelty that politicians lie to us. Morrison calling boat people illegal is just another political lie. False, but it's not unprecedented. But the attitude of Morrison stands oddly with his maiden speech. I took the trouble of looking up his maiden speech in Parliament, which he gave in 2014. And in the middle of his speech, he says this: "I turn now to the most significant influences on my life, my family and my faith. Family is the stuff of life, but there is nothing more precious. For me, faith is personal, but the implications are social, as personal and social responsibility are at the heart of the Christian message." I do wish that he'd read enough of the Christian message to understand that. He drew on the example of William Wilberforce, the great English campaigner against the slave trade. He quoted Desmond Tutu as saying, "We expect Christians to be those who stand up for the truth, to stand up for justice, to stand on the side of the poor and the hungry, the homeless and the naked." And he was inspired to add, "Those are my principles." Well, it's nice to know that he identified his principles, because you wouldn't have noticed them by watching what he does. He thinks family is precious, and very few politicians would dare to argue against that. But you'll recall that when Obama was President of the United States, a deal was done with America that they would take some of our refugees from offshore detention, and we would receive, well, it was very unclear who we'd be receiving, but apparently convicted criminals who couldn't be dealt with in America. Interesting. Anyway, that deal was saved by Malcolm Turnbull in that notorious telephone conversation he had with Donald Trump. And Donald Trump actually said something that was quite insightful in that conversation, because he referred to the people in offshore detention as criminals, and Turnbull said, no, they haven't committed any offence. And Trump said, well, why don't you just let them go? It was quite a good point. Anyway, Scott Morrison values the family, and we know that the Liberal Party have made much of family values in the past. Well, one of the people on Manus, a bloke who contacted me not long ago, he is one of the people who've been offered a place in America. The problem is his wife and children live in Australia. We're going to deliberately break that family apart in order to maintain the purity of Scott Morrison's principles. I was going to mention a little bit about an alternative. There is a better way of doing things. I would say, first of all, we need to shut down offshore processing, because it is outrageously cruel and outrageously expensive. And I would say, okay, let's assume that boats start coming again in the wake of closing down offshore processing. It's not clear, because that bloke, Sean Hands, who used to work with immigration, went public recently saying that the ring of steel that we've put across the top of Australia, the boat turnbacks and all that, make sure that boats will not arrive in Australia. Maybe. But I would say, let's assume that the boats do start coming. What will we do with the boat people who arrive? Well, I would say this. First, if you've got to put them in immigration detention, put them in immigration detention, but cap that at 1 month maximum. And use that month for preliminary health and security checks, which would be a reasonable precaution for any country. Second, at the end of 1 month, release them into the community on an interim visa that will last until their refugee status is finally determined. That can take between 3 months and 6 years. The interim visa would have a series of important conditions. First, they're allowed to work, which is kind of basic to human dignity. Second, they're allowed full access to Medicare and Centrelink benefits. Third, they have to stay in regular contact with the Department of Immigration, for example, by checking in weekly at a post office. And finally, until their refugee status is decided, they must live in a specified regional town or city. And I would hope Shepparton would be at the top of the list. If you make some more assumptions then, let's suppose the arrival rate of boat people, not only do they start up again, but let's pretend for a moment that they stabilise at the all-time record high of 25,000 a year. And let's suppose, against all the odds, that every single one of them remains on full Centrelink benefits for the whole time. It's an easy calculation that would cost the economy $500 million a year. Of course, all of that money would be spent in regional Australia, because when you paid rent and food and some clothing, there's not much left over from your Centrelink benefits. But we could stop harming refugees and start helping them. We could help regional Australia financially, and we could save $4,500 million a year, which, as taxpayers, I think we should all approve. That is an alternative which seems to have found no favour with our political masters. It's important that we recognise that the things human beings have in common are insignificantly small compared to the things, the things that divide us are insignificant by comparison with the things that we have in common. Very, very tiny. And the fact is, Shepparton shows the benefits of multiculturalism. It shows what you can do in a society where you want everyone to have a good chance and you welcome people from all over the world. Immigration, refugees and multiculturalism are a source of immense strength. They have made Shepparton, at least in large part by the example of Sir Andrew Fairley, and they could and should make the strength of Australia. They would at least restore our reputation as a nation that regards itself as decent. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Julian. Julian's very happy to take some questions, but has requested that you make them short and make sure that there is a question mark at the end of every one. Are there any questions? Yes.
Sorry, what about the refugees or whatever name you want to call them that are in detention now? Particularly the ones, that gentleman that died the other day, came as an unescorted juvenile or something. He came at 17 and died at, 26 or 23? What are we going to do about the people that are here now in our detention?
That's a good question. I think there are two classes of people in detention at the moment. There are people like that. And incidentally, that guy who died the other day had been accepted as a refugee 5 months ago. The department hadn't got around to telling him. So refugee applicants are one group. The other group are people who have been here on visas which have been cancelled on character grounds under Section 501. Now, I have strong disagreements about the way the Minister applies Section 501. He uses it in ways that break families, even when there's one case I'm aware of where the guy's parents were both Swedish. She got pregnant and they decided to have one last trip to Sweden before she had the baby. Complications happened in her pregnancy whilst they were in Sweden, and the doctor said, you can't fly back until after you've had the baby. So they flew back to Australia when the baby was 2 weeks old. 36 years later, he'd been on a permanent residency visa all his life. 36 years later, he got in trouble with the law. His visa was cancelled under Section 501, and the department removed him and dropped him on the streets in Stockholm. Now, that is a perfect example, I think, of circumstances where cancelling a visa is just outrageous and wrong. But that said, people whose visas have been cancelled for decent reasons need to be held in detention as an interim to putting them on a plane and taking them away. But for refugees, treat them like human beings, because they are.
Do you think we have too many comfortable people in Australia who are afraid to lose their status of comfort if we allow more refugees or asylum seekers into the country? And the politicians are telling us just that as well. Everything will change if we allow that, which is a frightening thing to do. So how do we overcome that?
Well, I think Shepparton should do everything it can to show the benefits of multiculturalism. I mean, it is a remarkable example that you set in this city. And the rest of Australia could benefit enormously. You know, there are some of the people on Manus and Nauru are people of immense talent. There's a guy on Manus who I heard recently say he's I think an astrophysicist and a mathematician. And he said after 6 years, he said, I'm trying to keep my maths polished up. 2 + 2 = 5. Incidentally, we have treated them so nastily that I had a conversation with Buruz Bashani the other day by Skype. Buruz tells me that most of the people held on Manus do not want to come to Australia anymore because we have so damaged our image in their eyes, they just don't want to come here. Although Farad, whose wife and children are here, does want to come.
Perhaps we have time for one more question. Is there one more? It's really difficult to see up here. Is there? Over there, yes, right over in the right-hand side. Got a mic?
You'll need a microphone, yeah.
Thank you. I don't understand why it takes so long to process them. And can you explain, what's the argument about having a processing centres in Jakarta or Malaysia or places that would allow people to be processed more quickly? Why are we so slow at doing that? And the cost would be less than leaving them on Manus or Nauru. Is that the case?
Certainly the cost of processing them here would be less than the cost associated with offshore processing. Why is it so slow? My cynical instinct tells me that it's because they're put at the bottom of the priority list. Now, I could be wrong. And with some refugee applicants, getting information from their country of origin is not simple. So I can understand why that takes a bit longer. The idea of processing refugee claims in Indonesia or Malaysia or Thailand, for example, I think is a very good one. Because what you could do is process their claims there, and maybe Australia should give some of its $4.5 million in savings to the UNHCR, specifically for use for processing in those countries, so people could apply for refugee status there, and if they're accepted by UNHCR as refugees, then they would be brought safely by aeroplane to Australia or New Zealand or Canada or Sweden or whatever other country was willing to take them. The one difficulty is that if the last leg of the journey is safe, the number of tire kickers is likely to increase. They will be rejected on their asylum claim, and they will then be a burden on society in Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, wherever they're processed. Now, one way of resolving that difficulty would be for Australia to throw some money at the governments of those countries. Out of the $4.5 million we've saved by shutting down offshore processing, I think that would be a worthwhile avenue to explore.
I'm now going to ask Professor John Dewar, the Vice-Chancellor of La Trobe University, to thank Julian and make some closing remarks.
Thank you, Andrew. As Elizabeth said in her introductory remarks, we've had an unprecedented response to this evening's event, which is why we've had to move it. Andrew, I don't recall a Fairley La Trobe lecture where we've had so many people want to attend. And I think it's evident why that's the case. I think the clarity with which Julian has set out the issues, but perhaps above all, that burning sense of injustice that he brings to his discussion of these issues is, I suspect, a large part of why so many people are here. If you're interested in learning more about this topic, there is another La Trobe University event in which Julian participated last week. In fact, it was the event in which he had that conversation with Buruz Bashani, that some of you will know as the author of No Friend But the Mountain. It was a remarkable occasion involving Julian, Burrows and Frank Brennan, and it was a debate about Australia's policy with respect to asylum seekers who arrived by boat. And you can find that if you go to our website and search for Ideas and Society, and you'll see that there's a video of the full event there. I was prompted by this evening's topic just to look at the statistics of our student body at our Shepparton campus. And I was curious to know how many of those students are migrants or refugees. And it turns out that about half of our students who are born outside Australia are indeed migrants or refugees. And I think that reflects the Shepparton community, which, as Julian has said, is a wonderfully broad-minded and welcoming community to those who come from such diverse backgrounds. Some of those will have come to Australia precisely because they were unable to be educated in the countries from which they came. And they have been able to achieve an opportunity here that they never dreamt of in the countries in which they were living previously. Some, however, and Julian's made this point, come with qualifications, highly qualified people, in fact. And there's a young woman over there who I'm thinking of, who falls into that category. And their qualifications are not recognised when they arrive. It's in a way that's another sort of injustice that we heap on people who come here. Anyway, Julian, on behalf of everyone here tonight, can I thank you most warmly for your talk this evening. Thank you. Finally, just a few thank yous from me. I'd like to thank Andrew Fairley and the Board of Trustees and the Fairley Foundation for being such wonderful partners with the university, not just for tonight's event, but for the 8 that have preceded it. I don't know if you're aware of this, Andrew, but you and I have known each other for almost 10 years. We've been wonderful friends during that period of time. We met over Shepparton, and your passion for Shepparton shines through every time we talk to each other. It's fantastic. I'd also like to acknowledge Amanda McCulloch from the Fairley Foundation and Christina Tate from our Shepparton campus for organising these kinds of organising this event. This has been a uniquely complicated one to organise, as you can imagine, and it's particularly complicated when you've got 2 organisations trying to work with each other to make sure that everything goes smoothly. And Amanda and Christine, you have done a fabulous job. Thank you very much. I'd also like to thank Cam and Ange Mangiamelli, the operators of tonight's venue, who've hosted us here tonight. They did so at short notice, and we're extremely grateful to them for stepping up to the challenge. Thank you very much indeed. And last but not least, I'd like to thank all of you for coming in such numbers this evening. We're absolutely delighted, and for your support, both for the Fairley Lecture and for La Trobe University. So that concludes our proceedings tonight, and I wish you all a pleasant evening and a safe journey home.